On the evening of November 16, 1581, inside a fortified palace in Alexandrov, Russia, a 51-year-old man stood frozen in horror, staring at his own trembling hands. They were covered in blood. His eyes, which contemporaries described as constantly darting around with suspicion, were now wide with disbelief. And on the floor in front of him lay his 27-year-old son, the heir to the Russian throne, blood pouring from a wound on his temple. The father dropped to his knees and began screaming. He threw himself onto his dying son, desperately trying to stop the bleeding with his bare hands. He sobbed uncontrollably, calling for doctors, begging God for mercy. The man who had ordered the deaths of thousands, who had drowned entire cities in blood, who had tortured men, women and children without hesitation, was now reduced to a wailing mess on the floor. Because this wasn't just any victim. This was his own son, his heir, the future of his dynasty, and he had just killed him with his own hands. The man's name was Ivan IV Vasilievich, but history would remember him by another name, Ivan the Terrible. And this single moment of rage would set into motion the destruction of everything Ivan had ever built. It would end a dynasty that had ruled Russia for over 700 years. And it would plunge an entire nation into chaos for decades to come. But how did one of history's most powerful rulers reach a point where he would murder his own child? To understand that, we need to go back to the very beginning, to a childhood so horrific that it would shape Ivan into the monster he would eventually become. Ivan was born on August 25, 1530, in the village of Kolomenskoye, just outside Moscow. His father was Vasily III, the Grand Prince of Moscow, and his mother was Elena Glinskaya, a Lithuanian princess known for her beauty. For the first 3 years of his life, Ivan lived in comfort and security, the cherished heir to an expanding Russian state. But then, in December of 1533, everything changed. Ivan's father developed an infection on his leg that quickly turned into blood poisoning. Within weeks, the Grand Prince was dead. 3-year-old Ivan was immediately proclaimed the new Grand Prince of Moscow. Of course, a toddler couldn't actually rule, so his mother Elena became regent, governing in his name. For 5 years, Elena managed to maintain control, protecting her young son from the ambitious nobles who circled the throne like vultures. And then, in 1538, Elena died suddenly at the age of just 30. The official cause was illness. But even as a child, Ivan suspected the truth that would later be confirmed. His mother had been poisoned. And the people who did it were the same nobles who were supposed to be protecting him. What followed would scar Ivan for the rest of his life. With both his parents dead, 8-year-old Ivan became a pawn in a brutal power struggle between Russia's noble families, known as the boyars. These were the aristocratic clans who controlled vast estates and military forces across Russia, and they saw the young Grand Prince as nothing more than a convenient puppet. The two most powerful factions were the Shuisky and Belsky families, and they fought viciously for control of the regency. But here's the thing. While they were busy scheming and murdering each other, they completely neglected the actual child they were supposed to be raising. Years later, Ivan would write letters describing his childhood, and the picture he painted was absolutely devastating. He wrote that he and his younger brother Yuri were brought up like vagrants and children of the poorest. He recalled being hungry, going without proper clothing, being completely ignored by the men who were supposed to care for him. One particular memory haunted him. He remembered a boyar named Prince Ivan Shuisky sitting on a bench in the royal chambers, leaning his elbow on Ivan's dead father's bed, putting his dirty boots up on a chair, not even bothering to look at the young prince. The contempt was unmistakable. But it wasn't just neglect. Ivan witnessed things no child should ever see. The palace became a battlefield of intrigue and assassination. Boyars who fell out of favor were dragged away and killed. Ivan watched as men were beaten, strangled, and left to rot. He saw what happened to people who had power one day and lost it the next. And so the young prince learned two lessons that would define his entire reign. First, that the boyars were his enemies, men who would use him when convenient and discard him when not. And second, that power was the only protection against a violent death. If you wanted to survive, you had to be more ruthless than everyone around you. By the age of 12, Ivan had developed a disturbing hobby. He would throw cats and dogs from the high walls of the Kremlin just to watch them die. He roamed the streets of Moscow with a gang of young nobles, terrorizing common people. And at age 13, he made his first political move. He ordered the arrest of Prince Andrei Shwisky, the leader of the boyar faction that had tormented him for years. The prince was thrown to a pack of starving hunting dogs. The boyars finally understood. The child they had ignored and abused had grown into something they couldn't control. On January 16, 1547, at the age of 16, Ivan was crowned not merely as Grand Prince, but as Tsar of all Russia, the first ruler in Russian history to claim that title. The word Tsar came from the Latin Caesar, the title of Roman emperors. Ivan was sending a message. He was no longer a puppet to be manipulated. He was the supreme ruler, answering to no one but God. And then something unexpected happened. Ivan fell in love. Her name was Anastasia Romanovna, and she came from a minor noble family. Ivan had selected her from among 1,500 candidates brought to the Kremlin for his inspection. But unlike what you might expect from a teenage tyrant choosing a bride like livestock, Ivan didn't pick Anastasia for political advantage. He picked her because something about her genuinely moved him. Anastasia was not considered a great beauty by the standards of the time, but she possessed a gentle nature and a soft voice that had an almost miraculous effect on her volatile husband. Court observers noted that in her presence, Ivan became calm. His famous temper, his paranoia, his cruelty, all seemed to fade when Anastasia was nearby. And for the first 13 years of his reign, Ivan was a remarkably effective ruler. With Anastasia at his side, he gathered a council of advisors called the Chosen Council and implemented sweeping reforms. He modernized the legal code, established local self-governance, created Russia's first standing army, and even brought the first printing press to Moscow. He conquered the Khanate of Kazan and the Khanate of Astrakhan, expanding Russian territory all the way to the Caspian Sea. People began to wonder if perhaps the troubled prince had truly transformed. Anastasia bore him 6 children, though only 2 sons survived infancy. The future seemed bright. But then came the year 1553, and everything began to unravel. That year, Ivan fell gravely ill. He was so sick that his doctors believed he would not survive. And as he lay on what everyone assumed was his deathbed, Ivan asked his boyars to swear an oath of loyalty to his infant son, the Tsarevich Dmitri. Most of them refused. Instead, the boyars began openly discussing putting someone else on the throne. Ivan's cousin, Prince Vladimir of Staritsa. Vladimir was an adult, a reasonable man, someone the boyars could work with. Why tie themselves to a dying Tsar and his infant heir when a better option was available? Ivan heard every word. And then, to everyone's shock, Ivan recovered. But he was changed. The betrayal he had witnessed from his sickbed had reawakened all the paranoia and hatred from his childhood. The boyars hadn't learned anything. They were still the same vultures who had tormented him as a boy, waiting for any sign of weakness to devour him and his family. For the next 7 years, Ivan watched and waited. And then, in 1560, the final blow fell. Anastasia, his beloved wife, his anchor to sanity, fell ill with a mysterious sickness. She wasted away over the summer, and on August 7, 1560, she died at the age of just 30. Ivan was devastated beyond description. At her funeral, he was crying so uncontrollably that he could barely walk. His courtiers had to physically hold him upright. But his grief quickly transformed into something darker, rage and absolute certainty. The boyars had killed her, just like they had killed his mother. They had poisoned the one person who had brought him peace, the one person who had kept the darkness inside him at bay. Modern forensic analysis has actually confirmed that Ivan may have been right. When Anastasia's remains were examined in the year 2000, scientists found mercury levels more than 10 times higher than normal, a clear sign of poisoning. But Ivan didn't need scientific proof. He already knew, and he was going to make every last one of them pay. In December of 1564, Ivan did something that shocked the entire nation. He suddenly left Moscow, taking his family, his treasury, and a selection of loyal servants. He retreated to a fortified settlement called Alexandrov Sloboda, about 60 miles northeast of the capital. And then he sent 2 letters back to Moscow. The first letter was addressed to the church and the boyars. In it, Ivan announced that he was abdicating the throne. He accused the nobility and clergy of treason, embezzlement, and conspiring against him. He declared that he could no longer rule a nation infested with traitors. The second letter was addressed to the common people of Moscow. In this one, Ivan assured them that he bore them no ill will. His quarrel was with the nobles, not with ordinary Russians. The effect was immediate and exactly what Ivan had calculated. The common people of Moscow, who generally supported the Tsar against the hated aristocrats, demanded that he return. A delegation of boyars and church officials traveled to Alexandrov Sloboda, literally begging Ivan to come back. Ivan agreed to return, but he had conditions. He demanded the absolute right to punish traitors however he saw fit, including execution and confiscation of property, without any interference from the Boyar Council or the church. He demanded the creation of a separate territory within Russia, directly under his personal control, called the Oprichnina, and he demanded the right to create his own personal army of enforcers, answerable only to him. The boyars agreed to everything. They had no choice. What followed was unlike anything Russia had ever seen. Ivan recruited 6,000 men to serve as his oprichniki, his personal guard and secret police. These men dressed entirely in black and rode black horses. They carried severed dogs' heads attached to their saddles, symbolizing their mission to sniff out treason, and brooms, symbolizing their duty to sweep traitors from the land. The oprichniki were given complete immunity from the law. They could seize property, arrest anyone, and execute people without trial, and they used these powers with terrifying enthusiasm. The first targets were the old princely families, the same boyar clans who had tormented Ivan in his childhood. One by one, they were accused of treason. Their lands were confiscated. Their family members were arrested, tortured, and executed. Entire noble lineages that had existed for centuries were simply wiped out. Ivan developed a particular cruelty in his methods. He didn't just want his enemies dead, he wanted them to suffer, and he wanted everyone to know about it. Public executions became elaborate spectacles. People were boiled alive, impaled, roasted over open flames, or torn apart by horses. Ivan sometimes participated personally, wielding the instruments of torture himself. And through it all, Ivan maintained an unsettling religious devotion. He would spend hours in prayer, banging his head against the floor so often that he developed a permanent callus on his forehead. He saw no contradiction between his faith and his cruelty. In his mind, he was doing God's work, purifying Russia of traitors and sinners. In January of 1570, Ivan turned his attention to Novgorod, Russia's second largest city and one of the oldest centers of Russian civilization. Rumors had reached Ivan that the city's leaders were secretly planning to defect to Poland-Lithuania, Russia's enemy to the west. The evidence was thin at best. Most historians believe there was no actual conspiracy. But Ivan didn't need proof. He needed an example. He marched on Novgorod with his Oprichniki army. But before they even reached the city, they left a trail of destruction through every town and village along the way. The entire region between Moscow and Novgorod was laid waste. When they arrived at Novgorod in early January, they surrounded the city, trapping everyone inside. The Oprichniki began by seizing the monasteries surrounding the city, looting their treasures and assaulting the clergy. Then Ivan entered the city personally. What followed was 5 weeks of systematic terror. The exact number of victims is still debated by historians. Contemporary accounts range from 2,700 to 60,000. Modern scholars estimate somewhere between 2,500 and 15,000 people were killed in a city that probably had no more than 20,000 inhabitants after recent famines and epidemics. Men, women and children were dragged from their homes. Many were bound and thrown into the freezing Volkhov River to drown. Others were tortured in the public squares. Ivan personally supervised many of the executions. When it was over, Ivan ordered the surrounding farmland burned. 90% of the arable land around Novgorod was destroyed. The city, one of the jewels of Russian civilization, was reduced to a shell of its former self. It would never recover. But Ivan wasn't finished. His cousin Vladimir of Staritsa, the man the boyars had wanted to put on the throne back in 1553, was still alive. That simply could not stand. In October of 1569, just months before the Novgorod massacre, Ivan had summoned Vladimir to Alexandrov Sloboda. There, Ivan accused his cousin of plotting to assassinate him and seized the throne. The evidence was almost certainly fabricated, extracted through torture from Vladimir's servants. Vladimir knew what was coming, but there was no escape. Ivan forced his own cousin to drink poison. Vladimir's wife and children were also eliminated. His mother, who had been forced into a convent years earlier, was drowned in a river along with several of her attendants. The extermination of Vladimir's family was a catastrophic mistake, though Ivan couldn't see it at the time. Vladimir had been the only other adult male of the Rurik dynasty, the family that had ruled Russia for over 700 years. By killing him and his children, Ivan eliminated the only backup if anything happened to his own heirs. And something was about to happen to his heirs. By 1581, Ivan was a broken man. The Oprichnina had been disbanded a decade earlier after its forces proved useless against an actual military threat, a Crimean Tatar invasion that had actually burned Moscow in 1571. Many of the Oprichniki leaders Ivan had elevated were themselves accused of treason and executed. The Livonian War, which Ivan had been fighting for over 20 years to gain access to the Baltic Sea, was ending in humiliating defeat. Russia's economy was in ruins, depopulated by years of terror, war, and famine. Ivan's physical health was deteriorating, his body racked by disease, but he still had his heir. Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich was 27 years old, and by all accounts, he was everything his father once might have been: intelligent, capable, and eager to prove himself. He had already been married 3 times. The first 2 wives had been sent to convents when they failed to produce heirs quickly enough to satisfy the Tsar. His third wife, Yelena Sheremeteva, was pregnant in the autumn of 1581. Finally, it seemed, the succession would be secured. And then came November 16th. The exact sequence of events is disputed by historians, but the most widely accepted account comes from Antonio Posavino, a papal envoy who was in Russia at the time and spoke with witnesses. According to Posavino, Ivan walked into his daughter-in-law's chambers and found Yelena dressed in only her undergarments. In 16th century Russia, Appearing before the Tsar in such a state of undress was a serious breach of protocol. Ivan flew into a rage and began beating the pregnant woman with his staff. The Tsarevich heard his wife's screams and rushed to her defense. He confronted his father, demanding that he stop. Father and son began arguing, their voices rising. And then Ivan did what he had done so many times before. He raised his iron-tipped staff and struck. But this time, he struck his own son. The blow caught the Tsarevich on the temple. He collapsed, blood streaming down his face. In that instant, Ivan's rage evaporated. He stared at what he had done, then fell to the floor beside his son, screaming. He tried to stop the bleeding with his hands. He called for doctors. He begged God for mercy. For 4 days, the Tsarevich clung to life. Ivan refused to leave his side, sobbing and praying without cease. He sent messengers to monasteries across Russia, begging the monks to pray for his son's recovery. On November 19, 1581, Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich died. Yelena, traumatized by her own beating, miscarried the child she had been carrying. In one moment of uncontrolled rage, Ivan had killed not only his son, but also his unborn grandchild. The dynasty was doomed. Ivan never recovered from what he had done. Contemporary accounts describe him wandering the halls of his palace at night, howling in grief. He tried to abdicate in favor of a Tatar prince, but this strange arrangement lasted only a year. He made lists of all the people he had killed during the Oprichnina and sent them to monasteries, requesting prayers for their souls. He attempted to marry again, seeking a bride from England, and even entering negotiations with Queen Elizabeth I. Nothing came of it. He grew increasingly erratic, his body failing, his mind consumed by guilt and paranoia. On March 18, 1584, less than 3 years after killing his son, Ivan the Terrible died while playing chess with one of his courtiers. Some accounts say he simply collapsed. Others suggest he was poisoned by nobles who had finally had enough. He left behind a ravaged nation and only one surviving son, Fyodor, his child by Anastasia. Fyodor was gentle, pious, and almost certainly intellectually disabled. He had no interest in ruling and no capacity for it. Power quickly passed to his brother-in-law, Boris Godunov, who would become Tsar after Fyodor's childless death in 1598. With Fyodor's death, the Rurik dynasty, which had ruled Russia since the founding of the nation, came to an end. What followed was the time of troubles, 15 years of civil war, foreign invasion, famine, and chaos that would kill millions of Russians before the Romanov dynasty finally restored order in 1613. All because one man couldn't control his temper. The painting that captured Ivan's crime has become one of the most famous and controversial artworks in Russian history, created by Ilya Repin between 1883 and 1885. Ivan the Terrible and his son Ivan depicts the moment after the fatal blow, the Tsar clutching his dying son, his eyes wide with horror and madness, blood pooling on the ornate carpet beneath them. The painting was so disturbing that it was immediately banned by the Russian government. It has been attacked by vandals twice, once in 1913 and again in 2018, by people who found its depiction of Russian history unbearable. But perhaps that's appropriate, because even the terrible story is unbearable. It's the story of a traumatized child who became a monster, who built an empire through brilliance and drowned it in blood, who destroyed everyone around him, including the people he loved most. In the end, the man who had killed thousands to secure his throne left behind nothing. His dynasty ended, his conquests were lost, his empire descended into chaos. The only thing that survived was his name, Ivan the Terrible, a warning across the centuries about what happens when unlimited power meets unlimited rage. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of history's most dramatic stories ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. Alright, until next time, see you.